In terms of the ICJ ruling, I mean, I assume this is being covered very heavily in Israel. Can we give us a sense of kind of Israelis' reaction to the way that this is being treated in the international community?
Being in Israel and covering the war from there, and being in the UK and doing it here, it's quite telling what the differences are and how differently people see it. Obviously, always a domestic audience from that perspective, when there's a war going on, they're always going to see things quite differently from the rest of the world. But the difference is really stark there, even before this hearing. I think that many people in Israel just can't understand the fixation on things like the idea of the day after two-state solutions, things like that, when they feel that they're in the middle of what is effectively an existential war, or a war that's bigger than virtually anyone there can remember, certainly one of the most consequential wars of the country's history. And I think there's a real sense that not only do they feel they're in the thick of that, but they feel that they're very misunderstood around the world. And this ICJ hearing is not going to help that. I think there is a real sense that the allegation of genocide among most people there is so outrageous that they can't quite believe that it even got as far as this in the courts, and that the court said that it was something that didn't need to be thrown out immediately, which of course is exactly what Israel was asking for.
You read quite a bit, or I've read quite a bit about precisely the themes that you're talking about, Jonathan, which is how the war is internalized in Israel, and the kind of real difference between Israel and the kind of complete bemusement that there is, and indeed stronger than bemusement on occasion, of how many Israelis perceive how the rest of the world is covering it. If one were to try and advance some of those arguments around kind of the structural problems which exist between Israel and Gaza and so on, I mean, is there any kind of hearing for that at the moment? And where do you think Israeli politics is at with all of this, and particularly internationally in the ICJ?
So Benjamin Netanyahu, as you know, is quite a divisive prime minister in Israel, and more so outside of Israel, and that's not really gone away. So maybe he had a bit of a break for a couple of months after the horrors of October the 7th. But now there are some people within Israeli society, whether it's on the streets or even, old foes of his politically, who are now talking about getting rid of him. And so Israeli politics is alive and kicking as it ever has been, even in the middle of this war. But he came out tonight after the ICJ result, and he said that Israel's commitment to international law is unwavering. And so it's his position, and I would say probably most of Israel's position, that everything that was said by the ICJ, it's really what they've been doing already, in their opinion. So Israel has maintained throughout all of this war that its efforts to move the population within Gaza out of harm's way, as they put it, that its efforts to warn them, its efforts to try to send troops in on the ground rather than to do everything from airstrikes, all of those things, among many others, are what they see as the ways in which they've tried to protect civilian lives in Gaza. Now, of course, the rest of the world's looked on and questioned that, and quite a few of Israel's allies have also questioned that. But it's interesting that you can read the ICJ's result today from an Israeli perspective, which says this is effectively them not saying Israel is carrying out a genocide yet. They're saying there is a case to be heard there. But for now, they have certain obligations, which they say they've always been respectful of. The new bit is that they have to write this report in a month, and that will be the start of a reaction from the South Africans and the rest of the international community. In fact, America's also said that it doesn't like this action going on in the ICJ. Britain said the same. Germany said the same. The State Department has come out and said that it's consistent with their view that Israel has the right to take action to ensure the terrorist attacks of October the 7th can't be repeated in accordance with international law. That's what they've always been saying. But they did say they continue to believe that the allegations of genocide are unfounded, and they note that the court didn't make a finding on that. So there is still an amount of support internationally for Israel's position on this. But of course, this is going to strengthen calls from some quarters that Israel needs to continue ensuring that it's keeping up with its obligations under the laws of war, so that people within Gaza aren't necessarily being punished in a way that is unfair and disproportionate from their military action. Israel says that's always been its agenda.
Is part of the reaction internally within Israel coloured by the argument which is put forward and by Benjamin Netanyahu, other senior Israeli officials? I've had put to me by Israeli government spokespeople, including Mark Regev, which is that they argue that the institutions of the UN, including to some extent the ICJ, they argue are geared against Israel. And that, I mean, there's even been this story which has been doing the round today, accusations saying that the WHO is sort of in league with Hamas. Is that part of the narrative in Israel?
Well, of course it is. And I mean, I don't think we need to treat that with such disdain, because look what else has happened today. Perhaps thinking it was a good day to bury the news, UNWRA, the United Nations department that's meant to look after exclusively Palestinian refugees, has said that it's fired 12 members of staff because Israel gave it clear evidence alleging that those people were actually connected with the October the 7th attacks. Now, just think how monumental that is. UNWRA, a UN body that's meant to be looking after the humanitarian needs of the Palestinian people, has actually got people within it that UNWRA itself has now fired and says it's investigating because they were involved in that brutal, horrific terror attack. Now, if that's the case, why should any other UN departments be immune from that same sort of thing? That is what Israelis have said for a long time. And those of us who've watched these matters for decades have also noted that it's not really surprising that this is the case with UNWRA. Israel has revealed rockets, weapons, all sorts of things in UNWRA facilities, UNWRA schools. They've revealed tunnels under these places. They've revealed Hamas and other terrorist organisations working for them.
You wouldn't subscribe to the view that the UN and its the various organs of the UN are institutionally wired against Israel. You wouldn't accept that.
I think actually I would accept that.
You think that the United Nations itself is institutionally wired against Israel and in favour of Hamas?
I wouldn't necessarily say in favour of Hamas per se, though UNWRA has been hijacked by Hamas, has clearly been shown by Israel in this action. And the US today has frozen funding of UNWRA because of this. So I think that's quite a big move for the US to take. And if you don't believe me, I appreciate it might sound unbelievable to people who don't follow the twists and turns of what goes on in the UN. It is really worth looking it up because it does sound unbelievable. But if you look at the history of the UN, it has certain biases built into it. It has certain actions, certain powers, certain balances between all the different nations there that absolutely do weigh against democracies like Israel in the region that it's in.
But could it also be the case, Jonathan? I mean, although any of that being true, but it could also be the case that Israel, certainly on a geopolitical level, simply finds itself more and more isolated because it is failing to carry world opinion with it and relies almost exclusively now on the patronage of the United States and some European powers, although in Europe even that support is starting to wane. We heard what Lord Cameron had to say yesterday, calling for a ceasefire now, or calling for a humanitarian pause which will become a ceasefire now. That's the case, and unfortunately Israel is more and more is a minority constituency.
Well, firstly, I would say, and this is a fairly typical Israeli perspective that you get out there, being in a minority doesn't necessarily make you wrong. And in terms of the UN and UN bodies like UNWRA, it certainly is demonstrable that often there is a massive bias, more than a bias. I mean, to have UN paid teachers, for example, the allegation is one of the hostages was kept in an UNRWA teacher's house and abused there. I mean, that's quite an outrageous thing. And the fact that the UN has actually not just said it's going to investigate these independently, but it's fired those people in the meantime, I think means that they give quite some credence to the allegations as well. And as I said, the US freezing the funding shows that perhaps they have. So the patronage of the US is a rather patronising way to put it.
It's not a patronising way to put it, Jonathan. It's just to say that the United States is your closest ally, but increasingly you are running out of allies. And you've just accepted yourself that Israel often finds itself in a minority.
I'm not Israeli. I'm just telling you how it is.
Yeah.
I would say that. Listen, I completely hear what you're saying, Lewis. I think it's a very hard pill for people to swallow when they hear that bodies like the UN, if they don't know a lot about the workings of them, may have these biases and problems within them. And I would just urge them to, go out and read more about it. Look at bodies like UN Watch, which have documented this for decades extremely well, and then make up their own minds. Absolutely. But I would say that you're also not necessarily right. Of course, people are concerned about the plight of the Palestinians and that they should have the humanitarian aid and supplies that they need. But all those countries that you listed are still supporting Britain, the EU, even America. They are still supporting Israel's military activity because they recognise that the enemy that it's fighting, that is to say Hamas, carried out such a brutal attack, said it will do it again, shown every intention of doing it again. And by the way, the other thing the ICJ said that should happen is that Hamas should immediately and unconditionally release over 130 hostages that it's still keeping.
Yep.
What did it do instead? It released a video of 3 of the women it's still torturing and keeping imprisoned in Gaza instead. So this sort of thing is really, I think, part of the problem, is that people can't reframe their vision of what's going on. And being out there, of course, as I said, it's an Israeli perspective, what I can see there. And being here, we see a British perspective. You've got to take on all the perspectives, take on all the evidence, look at them and come up with your own evaluation of what's going on.